Welcome to TV Games. My name is Dave, and I'll be your enthusiastic guide on this nostalgic tour through time and space, or just video games and the like. I'd like to take you back to where it all began for me personally. We'll be taking a look at a final piece of video game equipment from the New Jersey-based Connecticut Leather Company. You may know that company as Coleco, and you may know the console as the Colecovision. Today, on this thing.
This is the arcade experience. We're Colecovision, and we bring the arcade experience home. With arcade graphics, like Donkey Kong with multiple screens, just like the arcade game. Arcade controls, joystick, fire, and jump buttons. Arcade games, like Turbo, Cosmic Avenger, Venture, with 15 screens. And Zaxxon, games that let you have the arcade experience. Now you can bring the arcade experience home. Because your vision is our vision. ColecoVision.
By 1982, the video game industry was still thriving. The arcade remained a popular hangout, continuously showcasing new titles that featured more advanced gameplay and more detailed graphics. Meanwhile, the two most popular home consoles at the time, namely Atari's VCS, later renamed the 2600, and Mattel's Intellivision, were supplementing their unique game offerings with ambitious yet ultimately watered-down ports of these quarter munchers. Coleco, already seeing some success with their electronic handhelds, their Telstar line, and tabletop mini-arcades, decided to release a powerful home console that promised to further narrow the quality gap between the arcade and home versions of popular games. And by including what had been deemed as the quintessential home version of Nintendo's arcade hit Donkey Kong, they made good on their promise. This pack-in helped Coleco move 500,000 consoles by Christmas of 1982, which incidentally is when I received my box of Coleco. The game selection for the ColecoVision consisted heavily of arcade ports. These ranged from popular titles of the day to long-forgotten sleepers. And since Coleco also served as a third-party publisher for the 2600 and Intellivision, the ColecoVision had very few exclusives. However, the ColecoVision version was almost always superior to its competitors. And in the case of Coleco-published titles, there's some debate as whether or not these versions were intentionally phoned in to make the ColecoVision stand out even more in comparison. Being graphically powerful for its time, it's unsurprising that many ColecoVision ports were astonishingly close to its arcade counterpart, sometimes even indistinguishable unless played side by side. By the end of its life in 1985, 145 ColecoVision carts were released.
ColecoVision games are fairly compact, usually the same size as Atari's. The first-party titles all have a 12-second splash screen that cannot be skipped. Third-party titles, such as those from Parker Brothers or Activision, managed to bypass the screen by including a custom BIOS on their games at the cost of available space. Some games came with an overlay that slides easily into the keypad. A nifty little feature of the physical carts was a built-in receptacle for holding the overlays when not in use. If you find yourself wanting to build a strong starting collection, here's some titles I can humbly recommend.
Despite its relatively short lifespan in the market, Coleco managed to offer its customers a few add-ons to expand the capabilities of the console. They were commonly referred to as expansion modules. The first, and arguably the most popular, was expansion module number 1. This little device allowed you to play VCS cartridges on your ColecoVision, thus expanding the library of games playable on the console well beyond its competitors. And Atari did, in fact, sue Coleco for this device. They were unsuccessful in blocking the sale, however, seeing as Coleco proved that they used off-the-shelf parts and nothing proprietary by Atari to build this and distribute it. Eventually, Atari did see some royalties from the sales of these devices, while at the same time Coleco went ahead and briefly released a standalone Atari clone called the Gemini, which sported clever joystick paddle combo controllers. This is essentially an Atari 2600 shrunken down and, it just runs off the ColecoVision. The power runs and the AV. It has the same cartridge slot. It has the switches you need to play the games: color, black and white, left, right, difficulties, game select, and reset. Same ports too, and the Atari joysticks you own, and the paddle controllers, anything you own that works on the Atari, theoretically works on this as well. Plugged into the front, And while it's a little hard to get in and out, and you can't play ColecoVisions while this is plugged in, it is well worth having, because then you have only one console hooked up to your TV set. Expansion module number 2 was not really an expansion module in the traditional sense, as it was just a specialized controller, more specifically a steering wheel for use with a handful of driving games. It came packaged with a nice little port of Sega's Turbo. Further specialized controllers, such as the roller controller and the super action controllers, were not given expansion module status. These controllers were rather precarious to hook up. The ColecoVision's controller ports never seemed very sturdy, and were by some accounts, myself included, highly susceptible to static electricity that would render the port partially inoperable. And their placement inside the controller well gave you limited clearance to effectively remove and replace them. And while they definitely gave games more of an arcade feel, it's hard to ignore that they feel a bit toy-like. The Super Action Controller, meanwhile, gave a slightly better stick at the expense of an even more awkward method of holding the controller. And its extra colorful action buttons add more play options, but their long travel makes it feel like hand rehabilitation exercises rather than gaming. These days, my ColecoVision game sessions tend to favor titles that rely primarily on the stock controllers. Coleco would release one more expansion module in January of 1984. This was more popularly known as the Adam computer. While technically expansion module number 3, plugging it into the front interface like the VCS adapter, the computer was also available as a standalone unit, which had a cartridge port to play ColecoVision games on the top. The Adam was originally conceived as a super game module that promised to add more arcade-like features to home games that were usually cut for space, such as high scoreboards. However, seeing as the market was shifting to home computers that not only played more complex games, but performed other tasks as well, Coleco decided that they too had to follow suit to remain competitive. The Coleco Adam was quite ambitious, advertising itself as a complete computer package, including tape storage and printer, for $600. However, it was wrought with problems. Firstly, the power supply ran through the printer, meaning a non-functioning printer was the same thing as a non-functioning computer now. Second, there was no built-in BASIC, unlike other computers of the time. Coleco opted instead to have a word processor reside on the onboard ROM, with a separate Smart Basic data pack cassette needing to be loaded up to use it. It would be merely an inconvenience were it not for the third, most notorious flaw. That is, the computer had a tendency to erase any data pack cassettes that were left in or around the machine when it was turned on. This was due to poor internal shielding. Owing to the onslaught of manufacturing issues, plus fierce competition from Commodore and Apple, both of which saw aggressive price drops, Coleco discontinued the Adam in 1985, and with that, would leave the electronics business altogether. Coleco as a company held on for a few more years, primarily due to their Cabbage Patch doll line, but by 1988, it filed for bankruptcy and would be bought out by Hasbro a year later. The company that was synonymous with leather, plastic swimming pools, and electronic games was now history. When you compare Coleco's video game contributions to names like Atari and Nintendo, it's easy to see why it's often forgotten by the more casual observers. But that doesn't mean it didn't get some well-deserved love later on in years. In 1996, Kevin Horton stumbled upon a ColecoVision and a handful of games sitting on a thrift store shelf. After tinkering around with the hardware, he made his first homebrew game, a Tetris clone known as Kevtris. He sold this for $20 in limited quantities plus the cost of shipping. Soon, more and more homebrews would be released, breathing new life into the beloved console. In 2005, the Coleco name was revived to capitalize on the newfound nostalgia for the old games by Generation Xers, mainly selling revised versions of their LED sports titles like Electronic Quarterback. Also released was a handheld called the Coleco Sonic, which consisted of 20 built-in Sega Master System and Game Gear games. In 2014, the beloved ColecoVision would finally be given flashback treatment by AtGames. It was a long time coming for fans, seeing as Atari flashback line was already on their 5th version by the time this came out. And while I could discuss this really quick right now, I feel that maybe this deserves its own episode. So be sure to check back next week for the follow-up video where I fire this up and see how much nostalgia it could spew from its tiny package. This is Dave, and this was That Show. Thank you.
sort of phased out, and all of a sudden you were like the teacher on Peanuts.